Jon Kirkegaard, who's going to discuss the untapped potential of supply chain solutions. And Jon is the president of DCRA. So, Jon, my first question is, can you first provide a brief background of yourself?
Sure, Dustin. First, a quick background of DCRA, Inc. We're a firm founded in 2000, focused on strategic supply chain solutions, including patented sales and operations planning technology and real-time sales and operations planning, as well as very discrete and very pragmatic consulting methodologies to create real economic value add and ROA from applying supply chain concepts to broader business success. My background personally is a kind of a lineage of starting from engineering school and mechanical and then manufacturing engineering and spending a few years in industry, supply chain work, migrating to Booz Allen, doing strategy consulting after getting a master's degree in finance, and finding supply chain approaches is a great way to drive value add where traditional consulting would get bogged down in politics. And basically that revolves around finding ways to see where real financial flows take place. The rest of my background, I started DCRA to focus on real solutions, not just technology and not just management consulting, kind of the best of both. And then recently, in the last few years, we've created an operating division that kind of applies our own solutions to remanufacturing classic cars and classic car parts and shipping them, building to order all over the world. Back to you, Dustin.
Thank you. My first question is, can you talk about the state of supply chain solutions technology and compare that versus what is possible?
Thanks. That's a great question. And it's one that I think about all the time. And quite honestly, I guess I have real high expectations of what can be accomplished using a great supply chain strategy that's really drives and runs adjacent to or even in front of business strategy in a way. And I'm personally been pretty disappointed since, say, 2000, 2001 that the application of technology hasn't really focused on the root opportunity of flowing inventory, building more things to order, mass customization for product, creating jobs. It seems like it's been stuck in silos of ERP type of dedicated technology, and quite honestly, just too much of a genericization of the term supply chain. It almost doesn't mean anything anymore. I tend to focus more on sales and operations planning and can I make what I sell? Can I sell what I make? And creating a real balance of flow of goods and minimum consumption of working capital and high cash flow. So speaking of supply chain in terms of real financial gains, not functional, can I store more things in a warehouse? Can I take orders across multiple systems? But really looking at supply chain strategy as a way to sell more with less exposure, less risk, and less capital. Go ahead, Dustin.
And can you elaborate on what you mean by inventory?
Yeah, I think through many different experiences over the last 30 years, I found that and I can speak to these in exact quotes. I had a professor in engineering school that did a lot of consulting side, and he looked at us one day in a class and said, "You're going to be young engineers thrown into a problem. You're not going to know where to start solving a big multi-enterprise problem or just a problem with a little manufacturing facility. So start with inventory. It's going to show you what's really going on." Obviously, the JID, Kanban, just-in-time approaches do that. I had a conversation years ago with the leader of a supply chain software firm before I had joined Bill Gibson. I helped them go public, Booz Allen, and I asked Bill what his inspiration was for starting Manugistics at the time, and he said he'd seen so much manipulation of financials in companies, but if you looked at where the inventory flowed, it was very difficult to manipulate the numbers, and therefore you could find out where really really improve the operations and create value. Flash forward to today, and I think what's really missing in supply chain technology and solutions is really the full exploitation of what I'll refer to as sales and operations planning. But really what I'm trying to express with sales and operations planning is efficient use of working capital and matching of the supply and demand side and getting people in sync. And there's been a lot of intense interest in sales and operations planning in the last 10 years. More, even a lot of interest way before, but I mean from a technology standpoint. But I think what is really possible in supply chain is to really focus on future inventory. So, I mean, it's one thing to look at Amazon selling somebody else's inventory out of some of the warehouse, and that's pretty good economics for Amazon if they can take an order for $10. It costs $8, but they're collecting the $10 before they collect. They have to pay the $8. That's essentially an infinite rate of return. And I think Amazon using that model is really the best arbitrager of, I guess, the lack of sophistication of really using supply chain. But where I think it really needs to go, should go, we've helped a number of clients do this, is really understanding that when you are a manufacturer, just like a purveyor of hotels or airlines, there's a certain baseline level of business that if you can lock up in the future, you can offer that at a great discount versus the last minute buys or the shorter lead time buys. And so,
can you elaborate on what you mean by inventory?
Dustin, I sure can. I'll try to do this as succinctly as I can. We'll better tell you what I'm going to tell you than review some details. But the flow of inventory, the measurement of inventory, both on-hand inventory, other people's inventory, and what I call future inventory, master production schedules and to be produced inventory and goods, I think really tells the story of the health of a business and the effectiveness of a business far better, far earlier than financials, and is sorely underused in designing a business, measuring businesses, and would love to see it more exploited. Therefore, supply chain solutions that focus on as such, which I think the best example of that is sales and operations planning, which is trying to look at current inventory, transits, other people's inventory, master production schedules, and then demand and how you shape demand based on lead time and supply, lead time and price, I think is really the healthiest strategy that companies can take on. But it's not a software solution, which I think is where people get confused. It's really a solution that they use all sorts of enabling technologies to cut the cycle time and improve it. But to make my point about inventory as clear as I can, I've had a couple interesting insights over the decades trying to solve clients' problems, starting with a professor in engineering school, Philip Kahn, who was one of the leading work methods experts around the world, and he came in class one day and said, gentlemen and ladies, you're going to get thrown in a problem. As young professionals, you're not going to know where to start. Start with inventory, because it's going to tell you what's happening in truth beyond what is said, what is tribal knowledge, which can get to the truth of what's really going on, whether it's a plant or whatever. And then along comes my work at Booz Allen and strategy, and supply chain term gets invented, and really supply chain is really looking at flows of inventory across enterprises and how it's consumed, how it's made, and the measurement of that is really what drives truth and value much better than GAAP financials or IFRS financials or even cost accounting type financials. Another example of that is when I was at Booz Allen, I worked a lot with Manugistics in the early days and was one of the references to go public. And I spent some time with Bill Gibson talking late at nights on client implementations, and I asked him one time what inspired him to start Manugistics, and he said he'd seen a lot of distortion of financials in companies, but what he found was it was really hard, if not impossible, to the measurement of inventory, and therefore if you focus on where inventory is, you could really get to the heart of the problems and solve things. So now we flash forward to 2016, and in reference back to your first question on what is my perspective of the state of supply chain technology and supply chain solutions, I'm personally very disappointed because the technology leaders, the business leaders, the customers asking for what they need haven't really driven out what I think they really should be asking for, which is how to make inventory transparent no matter where it sits. Because today inventory sits across enterprises more like if we were going to book an airline flight to London tomorrow, and when you made a phone call or got on the internet, it looked at what inventory levels were last year this time, and you should be able to show up and get a seat on the flight, versus the way airline res systems really work is they have peering asynchronous that look like synchronous real-time systems that tell you up to the second of what availability is, and the systems price inventory generally higher and higher as less of it's available. In today's world, and whether you're selling auto parts or you're distributing furniture or your retail goods or your chemical plant with polystyrene and rail cars, there's really no transparency of inventory between enterprises. There's some latent ways that shared via EDI. There are some efforts to share inventory, but the lack of that inventory being available to examine on a pricing model, on a available to promise perspective, is really sad. And then compound that with there's very little sharing of what I'd call future inventory or master production schedule. So, in short, to answer your question, I think the future of inventory and supply chain solutions will be to make that inventory widely available at different levels of security based on who you are and what your relationship is with the enterprise. And one way that'll happen is through pricing, whereas potentially for many goods, pricing will be lower if you can plan ahead. So if I can plan 6 months ahead that I need a new mattress for my house, I get a better price than if I walk into the room store tomorrow and buy one off the shelf. And that makes total sense if you're a manufacturer and if you've ever tried to plan production and slot assets and capacity and plan for workforces in the future. So those are some snippets on what I think should happen. And quite honestly, I'm sure it will happen. I've been doing this long enough to know what will happen, but never good enough to know when the market will be smart enough to move aggressively in their own interest. Go ahead, Dustin.
And what about assemblies? Can you talk about what you mean by assemblies?
Well, I have done some philanthropic work with the state of Texas and with the Department of Commerce and some other workforce boards, and being asked to use supply chain knowledge and design to help create jobs and U.S. competitiveness, North American competitiveness. And I guess my answer will revolve around a tactical application of my last answer. The question's the last answer, and this question is I think there could be a lot to gain by many products and many firms adopting what I call assembly coordination strategies in their supply chain, whether it's postponed manufacturing concept or it's just importing key components of a finished good and then assembling to order or assembling to various markets. I think there's a lot of wins for everybody involved. There's wins for the company because it can dramatically reduce working capital and greatly increase the varieties and different customizations of the product. There's wins for government because it can create protection of intellectual property and reduce stress on ports and size of transportation networks. But what I find most opportunistic is it could be extremely beneficial for workforces where when goods are just sent off via design to be made in far off lands, there's a middle ground of making it, assembling it, that gets lost, which is a big feedback loop to design, and it creates lots of jobs. And there's lots of opportunities for people who can start with value add assembly manufacturing jobs that can move into more important roles as they apply themselves. But if you lose that middle ground, you lose the opportunity for those that may don't get the privilege of getting an engineering degree or some advanced degree to participate in manufacturing in a meaningful way, and therefore the GDP. So I think my answer is applying the sales and operations planning concept, having a component of your fulfillment strategy where you don't try to predict how many DSL modems or cable modems need to be made in red versus blue, but you keep the components and then change the case based on the order. As one example, we did that kind of strategy for a big client. Can be very, very simple in concept, but have profound impacts on financials, on the workforce, on a lot of the topics that we hear in the news today. I think it's a real applied concept that I think can do a lot for just about any industry, even process industries, because even process industries generally will put their goods in a package, and that packaging approach, or that packaging step, generally is the constraint, the Herbie, if you've read the book The Goal, that bottlenecks a lot of their manufacturing flow. Go ahead.
And what does the future hold?
Well, I think I touched on a bit of that in the last few questions, but I'll come back and summarize it and try to tell you what I tried to tell you and see if it makes sense. I think the future is somewhere along the line, supply chain technology will be as effective as Google is for doing a search. We did this 10, 12 years ago. We patented real-time sales and operations planning that works much like Google to go out and find pools of inventory, pools of production, order similarities, and aggregate that information in a less precise but more accurate way. And then as you become more and more communicative and common XML or JSPs or whatever your communication form is with your network, it becomes more and more precise. But it doesn't take a genius to say there's got to be something that's going to be a breakthrough in multi-enterprise technology, which works more like how Google works and less like looking down rifle barrels of discrete single enterprise information. And then, who knows what happens first? Is it the application that uses that information that drives the sharing of the data, or is it the sharing of the data that drives the applications? We personally believe and put our money where our mouth was, 2003, 2004, 2000 up to 2008, we invested heavily in these patents and applications that make the data more transparent and visible. And we quite honestly thought by now most companies would have their supply chain execution repositories that would be available for themselves, and then they can turn on and off firewalls to share with their trading partners, and share what they want to share with the extended enterprise to make sales happen better. And we call this application order commit, being in our experience in trying to help clients turn around businesses, improve businesses, we found that there's always resistance. But the least resistance is when you can say you can serve the customer better. You can say to leadership that you will help create the incremental order, which creates incremental ROA on the assets already spent. So I believe that is the future. I'm in almost disbelief that in the last 10 years we haven't seen an explosion of the application of these concepts to multi-enterprise manufacturing, GDP, inventory, mass customization and building of things. And we've seen an explosion of this kind of technology to sharing pet videos on social networks. And I can almost assure you that the impact on GDP of applying this thinking to supply chain is the most impactful thing to GDP that could happen, and it's going to happen. And why it hasn't happened, you could probably spend hours debating, whose interest it's been to stay in the status quo. I personally believe that GAAP accounting and IFRS accounting have been are as much of the problem as a solution, and that there's so much pressure for financial control that systems developers build systems around control, not around revenue and flow of inventory and serving the customer. But there are some phenomenal exceptions, and so I think the future can be seen in really, if you dig down deep, of the market leaders in probably every industry, from Amazon to Walmart to how Coach handbags are created to how Dell computers are sold. I think you'll see in almost every SIC code that the leaders in these industries have created systems that work out front of the GAAP accounting and the ERP systems to drive behavior and culture around these concepts, all with varying degrees and all still just marginally better than the competitors, but just a small margin, 2 or 3% better at this than your competitors can mean enormous gains in profitability and market share. So I think if you study the facts today, I think you find that the future is here. I mean, the future is being practiced, but it's still, I think, held as a close competitive trade secret by these firms. And that's a lot of what our firm has been focused on, is bringing those concepts down to small and medium businesses and business of all sizes, because quite honestly, we believe the leverage of these concepts is actually easier as a small business than a larger business.
And thanks, Jon, for sharing today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dustin.